Go ahead.
Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to go over the draft statewide utility wildfire general order. I'm Alex Lopez. I'm an environmental scientist in the Wetlands Permitting and Enforcement Unit 2, which is one of our water quality certification units here at State Board. And I'm joined today by Watersheds and Wetlands Section Manager Paul Hahn, Senior Environmental Scientist Jean Bandura, and my colleague Nimisha Patel. Now, we've called together this meeting today to provide a staff overview of the intent and contents of the order. This includes the purpose and scope of the order, which activities will and will not be covered, and how the order will relate to other water board permits. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the conditions of the general order, discuss next steps, and then we'll finish the meeting off with a Q&A session. And please note that for the Q&A, we will not be receiving oral comments on the order or the related environmental impact report today. The purpose of the Q&A is to respond to clarifying questions on the presentation, and the contents and intents of the order. If you have formal comments that you'd like to make, we'll be bringing the order before the board at a hearing on Tuesday, August 20th at 9 a.m. at the Cali PA building in Sacramento. We will repeat information on how to comment and provide more information on that board hearing towards the end of the presentation. So again, if you'd like to make a comment, please do so orally during the board hearing or in writing at any time during the public comment period. And if you have any questions or technical issues during the meeting, please email Liz Reese. I've dropped her email address in the chat box. I've also dropped a couple of links to a few relevant documents for your convenience. Please, I ask that you hold substantive questions until the end of the meeting. At that point, I'll provide information on how to participate in the Q&A session. So with that out of the way, I would like to hand things off to Jean Bandura to provide today's presentation. Jean?
Thanks, Alex. Good morning, everyone. Give me 1 second to get the slideshow started. Maybe 2 seconds. Okay, good morning. Thanks for your patience there. Thank you, first of all, for joining us and for your time this morning. As Alex said, I'm Jean Bandura, the Senior Environmental Scientist for the Wetlands Permitting and Enforcement Unit 2 at the State Water Board. Welcome to this workshop where we're going to provide an overview of the Utility Wildfire General Order that was released for public comment on June 28th. This presentation is being recorded and the video will be posted on the Water Board's webpage following the meeting. Before I dive into project specifics, I want to thank you again for joining us this morning. Before I begin the overview, let me briefly explain the documents listed on the slide. Oh, you know what? I skipped one slide. Sorry about that. It's a quick trigger over here. So here's an agenda of what we'll be covering today. I'll start by discussing the general purpose and scope of the order. Next, I'll review the activities included in the order, as well as related activities covered by other water board permits. I'll provide an overview of the different activity categories, project conditions, and the requirements for monitoring and reporting. And finally, I'll touch on the fee structure that's associated with this permit. And then we'll end the meeting with the Q&A session. Before I begin the overview, let me briefly explain the documents listed on this slide, which includes the full list of documents released for public comment. Although the text and links may be too small to read now, they will be available following the meeting. And they provide all 11 documents that are released for comment, but there's really 2 main documents that we're here to discuss. There's the main general order, so the permit, the discretionary action that's being taken by the water board, and that's the priority focus for today's meeting. Because the activities authorized under the permit could have significant impacts to the environment, we've developed the related environmental impact report, which is also available for public comment. Now I'm going to go over the general order purpose. Why did we develop the general order in the first place? The number one priority is to protect water quality as these electric utility activities are conducted. That's our primary responsibility here at the Water Board. The second priority is to support the mandate of Senate Bill 901, which established additional wildfire mitigation plan requirements to keep up with the pace and scale of wildfire mitigation activities throughout the state. The third priority is to provide consistent regulatory requirements throughout the state, as well as ensuring compatibility with other environmental permits. We recognize the critical public safety need that the utilities provide through their electrical services, but we also acknowledge that these activities can impact the environment. They can impact water quality if there's not the appropriate steps taken if there's not the appropriate water quality protections in place. The current permitting process for covering these activities here at the Water Board is to issue permits on a project-by-project basis. And this requires both the regional water boards and applicants to expend considerable resources, which brings us to our fourth priority, which is to provide a regulatory framework under which electric utility projects are covered. This approach will bring consistency to utility activities and the way that they're regulated across the state while still protecting water quality. Before detailing the scope of the general order, I want to briefly describe the structure of the order. The order itself does not authorize any specific activity. Rather, it provides a framework under which future projects are enrolled. The best way to think about this framework is the general order is an umbrella under which specific activities are enrolled. Now I'm moving on to the scope. Since electric utility activities are conducted throughout the state, the geographic scope is statewide. Covered activities are those that result in soil disturbance and are conducted for the purpose of either wildfire mitigation, post-fire response, and operation and maintenance. It's important to note that this general order serves as both a 401 water quality certification under the Clean Water Act and regulates discharges to water bodies within state and federal jurisdiction. And in addition, electric utilities outside of a water body that are near waters or in a high-risk environmental setting can also discharge to waters of the state. And that's where the Water Code steps in to establish waste discharge requirements. In other words, this order applies to work within a delineated water body in addition to certain activities outside of waters that have the potential to discharge waste. The last thing I'll mention on this slide is that throughout the presentation, I'll use the terms water bodies, surface waters, and waters of the state interchangeably. And what I mean here is what you picture when you think of a surface water, a river, lake, wetland, etc. So now on to the covered activities. So in the general order on page 8, you'll see a list of activities, and those are the activities specifically covered under the general order. They're those listed on the slide. And in addition to these covered activities, there's specific scope criteria established for each one. And I'm going to describe what I mean by that over the next few slides. It's critical for knowing whether or not enrollment is required if you're conducting these activities. An example of a specific scope criteria is herbicide application. Herbicides are applied by utilities to prevent vegetation growth near utility infrastructure. As proposed in the draft order, herbicide application is within the scope of this permit when herbicide application is within 100 feet of waters of the state. Other activities on this list are covered, all of the other activities on this list actually are covered only when they result in soil disturbance that is either close to a water body, on a steep slope, or on erodible soils. And we'll go into some of those details in just a second. But first, I want to talk about perspectives just a bit. So the activities listed on the previous slide require coverage under the general order if they result in soil disturbance. Since electric utilities occur across the landscape, and some may not impact waters of the state, for example, debris removal that's far away from debris removal that's on a developed site, certain activities don't impact water quality. So we developed these activity-specific scope criteria to designate when a project is covered and when it's not, based on activities that are more likely to impact water quality. And that ties to their environmental setting. The photo of the Feather River Canyon provides a visual perspective of similar processes that can occur on a smaller scale. Waste and pollutants from activities up the hill slope are going to make their way down the watershed and potentially impact water quality in the Feather River. Of course, the closer that activity is to a water body, the steeper the slopes, the greater the likelihood that that activity impacts water quality downslope. Over the next few slides, I'll share some examples of how slope and proximity to waters is considered for determining whether an activity requires coverage. For a complete list of criteria for each covered activity, again, please look at page 8 of the general order. For additional context, I quickly want to mention a couple of terms that we'll use over the next few slides where we've captured the perspective just shown. We're all familiar enough with the concept relayed by the image on the right, which is percent slope. It's sometimes referenced as grade. The higher the number, the steeper the slope. You may not be familiar with K value, which is a variable of the universal soil loss equation. K value is the soil erodibility factor, which represents both the susceptibility of soil to erosion and the rate of runoff. Soils high in clay have low K values because they are resistant to detachment, where conversely soils with a higher K value are more erodible, such as silty loams. Another note on terms for context, you may hear me use the term project and activity interchangeably throughout the presentation. As obligated by CEQA, the Water Board considers the whole of the action when evaluating a project's environmental effects, but we still look to the utilities for determining how to group activities into a single application or a single project. For those of you familiar with the regulatory process, an application for 401 certification coverage may be for a single pole replacement. Alternatively, a single application or capital P project may include several related activities, such as access route blading, culvert installation, vegetation management, all at the same time. In this order, we use activities to distinguish the many types of activities that may be conducted under a capital P project. Although we considered doing so, the draft order does not dictate how utilities should separate projects or activities for the purposes of enrollment, but we were intentional about allowing space for utilities to seek coverage for multiple activities under a single application. And additionally, we carved out instances where programmatic submission can satisfy certain requirements. For example, some of the reporting requirements that I'll discuss in just a bit. Finally, moving on to the slide in front of you, I'm now going to expand on some of those activity-specific scope criteria that I mentioned. This determines whether enrollment is required for a planned activity. The image on the right demonstrates vegetation management activities that are conducted by electric utilities. Utilities clear vegetation along power lines to prevent ignition and for other reasons, for example, to clean up areas following a wildfire. As proposed, vegetation management activities would be required to comply with the order if the activity has the potential to increase surface water temperature, result in soil disturbance within 100 feet of waters of the state, or disturb soils on steeper slopes or more erodible soils. Excuse me. Moving on to access routes. Coverage is required for construction, reconstruction, maintenance, or improvements of access routes that are used by utilities to access utility electrical infrastructure. This activity is covered when work involves more than 100 feet of access road work anywhere across the landscape. This activity category is unique in that perspective, in that it's work across the landscape that could trigger enrollment, where the other covered activities have to be near waters or on steep slopes or highly erodible soils. So access route activities are covered when there's 100 feet of access route anywhere across the landscape, or when access route work occurs within 500 feet of the waters. The difference for this scope distinction compared to other activities is because access roads are a primary source of sediment and other pollutants to California surface waters. As just one example of the water quality impacts that result from increased sediment loads, increased sediment pollution diminishes water quality that provides habitat for fish and other aquatic species. Specific road-related activities conducted by utilities include grading, blading, and brushing of the root surfaces, or culvert replacement or maintenance. It's important to note, though, that access road coverage is only required when utilities propose these activities. Coverage is not required for simply using the road. I now want to cover the criteria for pole and tower related work. The intent of the order is not to cover every pole project that electric utilities conduct. We want to focus on those that are higher risk to water quality. Therefore, coverage is only required where soil disturbance is within 50 feet of waters of the state, or where soil disturbance is on steeper slopes or more erodible soils as shown on the slide. Vegetation management, access routes, and herbicide applications, the scope distinctions I just mentioned, are unique compared to all remaining activities. The pole tower replacement enrollment criteria shown on the slide applies to everything else on that activity list. Moving on to what's not covered under the order. Projects that meet certain criteria do not require enrollment. Such projects may still require coverage under another water board permit. As I mentioned, the scope is statewide. However, the order does not provide regulatory coverage in urban areas as designated by the Census Bureau, unless those areas are within a CPUC high fire threat district. This decision recognizes that work in urban areas unrelated to wildfire mitigation has unique considerations that are best handled through another permitting tool. Additionally, projects that pose a lower risk of discharge, such as vegetation management beyond 100 feet from waters, are excluded from this order. There are other existing water board permits that cover activities related to the general order. Two prime examples that you may already be familiar with are the State Water Board's general water quality certifications and the Army Corps' the State Water Board's certification of the Army Corps' emergency permits and the Army Corps' nationwide permit 57 for electric activities. If projects qualify for enrollment under those orders or another existing action, authorization under that action must be obtained, and coverage under this order is not required. We already have something in place that's working, so we're leaving that as is. Similarly, the permit covers activities in uplands that do not discharge to waters of the state, which means we needed to thoughtfully consider alignment with the CGP. Projects with all activities covered by the CGP do not require coverage by this order, but projects where there's some CGP covered and other CGP exempt activities are required to enroll. Those exempt activities, but are excluded or covered from certain order requirements. For example, development of an erosion and sediment control plan wouldn't be required under both orders. And those details for which aspects of the general order align with CGP coverage are listed on page 11. I'm now going to move away from describing what is covered by this order to discuss the compliance standards or requirements that apply to covered activities. So now we've talked about, are you in or are you out? And if you're in, then what does that look like? I'll start with an administrative distinction. All activities covered under the general order are divided into two categories based on their threat to water quality. Category A is non-notifying. In other words, it doesn't require submittal of an application for enrollment. The application's called a notice of intent, where Category B does require that application. Additionally, Category B has a subcategory for wildfire response activities, which I'll explain in just a bit. Here are the specific eligibility requirements for Category A. They're listed on page 14 of the order. Projects eligible for Category A are those that will not involve any in-water work, use of heavy equipment on saturated soils, installation of new access routes, and project activities will not occur on steeper slopes or erosive soils as defined. Category A was established because we recognize that some activities are routine and pose a lower threat to water quality. For these, we're establishing minimum standards for water quality protection, but we're not requiring application or reporting requirements. The permit does require that utilities track Category A activities and make that list available upon request by water board staff. This will provide efficient coverage while ensuring the water boards have the ability to review or inspect projects where necessary. I mentioned that the intent of the order is to establish minimum standards for water quality protection for both Category A and B activities, but we're only requiring advance notice reporting for some. And what I mean by this is that all applicable conditions or best management practices that describe how work is completed in the field apply to all relevant activities. So I'm going to go over a couple of examples of that. This general order includes a variety of construction-related conditions that are necessary to ensure that project activities will avoid, minimize, and mitigate for impacts to waters of the state. Conditions are listed in Section F of the general order beginning on page 9. Again, since poorly constructed and maintained access routes can be a major source of sediment to surface waters, we prioritized access routes and watercourse crossing related conditions. These conditions are aimed at hydrologically disconnecting roads, installing drainage structures to help disperse runoff, and sizing watercourse crossings for the 100-year flood flow. We also define terms related to access routes that may be unclear. Examples of defined terms include access route construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and decommissioning. Access road related requirements were developed in consultation with sister agencies to ensure that they're consistent with standard rural road construction practices, especially requirements under the forest practice rules. And I know I've been talking at the screen a lot, and we're all looking forward to getting to the Q&A portion. Just so you know, I'm over halfway done with the presentation. So now moving on to tribal cultural resources. The general order also has specific conditions related to protection of tribal cultural resources. These conditions require utilities to follow existing regulatory requirements to confirm that there's no tribal cultural resources within the project area, and if there are, to consult with affiliated tribes to develop and implement protective mitigation measures. Note that there are exceptions to this process for wildfire response activities. And now I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the notification and review process for Category B projects. So you know an application and reporting requirements apply. For those activities, the NOI must be submitted 45 days before the planned activity, and it must contain all of the information listed in Attachment A, which includes the application form and instructions for completing that form. The water board staff person assigned to the project will review received applications for completeness within 30 days of receipt. Any incomplete applications will be returned with a description of the information needed to identify deficiencies. Information needed to satisfy deficiencies. If water board staff does not issue an NOA within 45 days of receipt of a complete application, then the project may proceed. Additionally, water board staff will issue an NOA will issue any NOA within 45 days of a complete application. And alternatively, if a project is ineligible for coverage, let's say there's an application received for electric utility discharges associated with construction of a new residential development. So wholly new construction that's not covered under the order, it's not for one of the purposes that I listed, a notice of exclusion would be issued. Category B monitoring and reporting requirements are summarized in Attachment D. For those of you already familiar with individual 401 certs, you may recognize many of the same requirements for activities that will discharge to waters of the state. All Category B notices of intent include a minimum amount of information, such as project location, a description of planned activities, and erosion and sediment control plan information. Additional details are required dependent on the activity type. For example, projects that require construction within the waters of the state, such as undergrounding through a wetland, are required to submit a restoration plan that outlines how the resource will be protected during construction and after all work is completed. I briefly want to provide more detail on the wildfire and response activities category that I mentioned. This is where we have an exception to our notification process for a subset of Category B. Response activities occur when unpredictable weather or another unforeseen event results in the need for a short duration project to restore or maintain service. And wildfire activities are taken in response to wildfire. For both activity types, dischargers shall notify the water board as early as possible and no less than 72 hours prior to initiating work. If that 72-hour window is infeasible, notification is required within 1 day of beginning work. These activities will still be publicly noticed on our water board's web pages. Here's an overview of some of the plan requirements associated with Category B projects, or rather required of Category B projects. Again, the distinction or difference between Category A and Category B isn't only that they're notifying or non-notifying, it's these additional reporting and planning documents required of Category B projects. Note that all soil disturbing activities must prepare and inspect for effective erosion and sediment control, but only Category B dischargers are required to report following inspections. The remaining report types, vegetation management offset plan, which is required when there's vegetation management impacts that trigger the requirement in the order, restoration plans or compensatory mitigation plans, which are required when there's temporary or permanent impacts to waters, and dewatering plans are all required of Category B activities when they are relevant to the planned activity. I want to now go over one of those listed plans in a bit more detail. It's one you may not be familiar with. Category B dischargers, upon request of water board staff, shall provide a vegetation impact offset plan. This plan is required to offset the impacts from vegetation removal within 100 feet of certain impaired, large, or fish-bearing water bodies with utility-compatible vegetation or through an alternative enhancement project. A plan that covers multiple applications may be provided in advance, so the details of this plan shouldn't delay work. Switching gears, I would like to briefly mention fees. Category A projects are not subject to any fees. Category B projects that include dredger fill discharges are subject to the dredge and fill portion of the fee schedule that you're used to and familiar with if you work on water quality certifications, and projects without a discharge of dredge or fill are subject to the waste discharge requirement of the fee schedule. We're not revising fees as part of this project. Project fees are handled through a separate regulatory process. My intent with this slide today is simply to acknowledge that there are fees associated with this permit. And this is my last slide on the general order content. As I mentioned, conditions, monitoring, and reporting requirements that I touched on in today's presentation is really just an overview. And if anybody on the line wants to get into additional details, water board staff are definitely available for future meetings if we don't answer all of your questions in just a minute. And before I hand it back to Alex for the Q&A portion, I want to provide an overview of next steps. We definitely value your input, and we're accepting comments on all draft documents until August 30th. For instructions specific to how to submit a comment, please refer to the public notice that was linked in the chat. We'll link it again at the end of the meeting. And of course you had it because that's why you're with us today. A State Water Board workshop will be held on August 20th at 9 a.m. at the Cal EPA building in Sacramento. During that, excuse me, it's a hearing actually, and during that hearing, you will be able to provide oral comments. And then up until August 30th, you can provide written comments. Following the close of the comment period, staff will review and respond to comments and consider changes to the draft documents. If all goes according to schedule, we anticipate presenting the permit for consideration of State Water Board adoption in February of next year. Thank you for your time this morning, and here's some contact information if you want to have those follow-up meetings or you have something that comes to mind once you become more familiar with the document contents. And I'm going to hand it back to Alex now.
Thank you very much, Jean. All right, so we have come to the Q&A portion of the presentation. As a reminder, the purpose of the Q&A is to respond to clarifying questions on the presentation and the contents and intent of the order. We please ask you to save your formal comments on the order for the board hearing on August 20th or for the public comment period. Now, if you'd like to speak, I ask that you please first enter your name and the name of your organization or agency into the chat box. Once you do that, you can ask your question by either typing your question into the chat box for water board staff to read aloud, or if you prefer to use your microphone, you can wait until you are called upon and you can unmute your microphone at that time. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll call on participants in order. All right, first off, we got Kyler Stappelman. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Kyler wants to ask, how does the board envision the order working in tandem with the construction general permit when utility work may qualify for a maintenance exemption?
Thanks, Kyler. So that was the alignment that I was describing earlier. And in the chat, we can provide the specific section of the general order that describes alignment with the CGP. But the takeaway is that those activities would require enrollment under this general order because they're not covered by the CGP.
Thank you.
To clarify, I'm describing here the exemption for maintenance activities that's specific to the CGP. I'm not talking about the maintenance exemption for 404F activities. If those activities are exempt from the Clean Water Act, then you would need to talk with regional board staff to determine whether or not coverage is appropriate. We don't speak to that specifically in the general order. Kyler, was that your question?
Thank you, Jean. Specifically thinking about the construction general permit, I think you had sort of touched on this during the slide. I just, wanted to be clear about how that would work with maintenance exemptions under the CGP. So you answered that question. Thank you.
Thank you for asking. Good morning, Rick. I'll hand it back to you, Alex.
Yeah. Hi, Rick. So Rick is asking, Rick Taylor from Southern California Edison wants to know, does access route surfaces, or shall they be hydrologically disconnected, refer to all new and existing roads?
So the goal of new access road construction is hydrologic disconnection. We recognize that sometimes that alternative isn't feasible, and there is an off-ramp for that in the order, but that would need to be discussed with water board staff, and that does not apply to existing roads. You wouldn't need to go in and repave existing roads for hydrologic disconnection, but many of the conditions that do apply to existing roads do meet that end goal of hydrologic disconnection. So ensuring that stream channels do not form within the roadway and that those stream channels are separate and water quality is not impacted by those activities. So this is where we would need to get into the weeds of pulling up the full list of conditions and talk about the details. to say whether or not it does or doesn't apply. It's not a blanket yes or no.
Thanks, Sheena. I don't know if you can hear me. Hopefully you can.
We can.
Thank you. Yeah, that actually is good to hear. So thank you. That was a big concern.
All right, thank you, Rick. All right, next up we have Andrea Aberhell from CMUA. Could you clarify the delineation of waters of the state? Could a definition be included in the general order?
I'm going to grab this one.
Please.
Yeah, hi, this is Paul Hand. Hey, we provided a definition of waters of the state within our dredger fill procedures. We could consider putting in the a reference to that definition in the general order, and that would be a great comment for you to provide in your written and oral comments. But we do not intend to define it any further or any differently than what's in the dredger fill procedures. Does that help, Andrea?
Yes, just for some that are not familiar with it, and I will take that feedback. We'll definitely include in our comments our quest to at least do a cross-reference to that definition, just to make sure things are kind of all in one place. So I appreciate the answer.
The one thing that you should appreciate is that within our dredger procedure, the only one that we have specifically defined with characteristics is wetlands. So the other waters of the state fall within the larger and more broad definition provided by Port of Cologne. And we are not proposing to refine those definitions for other waters as part of this permit.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Next up, we have Matthew McNichol from SFPUC. Is the methodology for selecting K-factor values of 0.2 discussed in the EIS? Additionally, the interpretation appears to be 30% slope and K equals 0.2 plus, meaning both values are present. Is that correct?
Yes, where we rely on those distinctions, those are the values, the cutoff thresholds that are consistent for related activities, and that methodology is discussed in the EIS. It's an EIR in this instance. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Matt. Next up, looks like it's Timothy Andrews at PG&E. Has the SWRCB evaluated the geographic area that this permit may encompass, i.e. all areas within 50 feet of waters and slopes greater than 30% plus K greater than 0.2?
Yes, we have done that. We have actually have done some GIS work. We opted not to provide a copy of that as part of this presentation because while it takes into account the slope and erosivity, it doesn't address it doesn't show the areas within 50 feet of waters. But yes, we have taken that into account. We do anticipate that this will impact different areas of the state differently. So for example, those areas that are in the North Coastal region, they are much more likely to be notifying than are, say, the ones that are in the Southern California regions. And that has simply to do with the combination of erosivity and slope.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Timothy. And that is the, oh, here we go. Looks like we got one more from Robin Yamada at LADWP. Can you please provide additional information regarding the intent of the board hearing on August 20th and the timeline for when the next draft of the order would be released and when the board adoption hearing would take place? Is there a possibility of extending the current comment period? Paul?
Yeah, thank you. So our approach to this is we want to have a staff workshop, which is today. The primary purpose of this workshop is to make sure that we have an opportunity to speak with interested stakeholders to ensure that they understand what we have proposed and ask clarifying questions about what we proposed. On August 20th, that is the opportunity for folks to provide comments to the board at a public meeting. We are extending the comment period past the board meeting to the end of August, and that's for the written comment period. At this point, I would not expect that extending the current comment period would be approved by the board, because we're already doing, I think, a 60-day comment period, which is about twice as long as we normally provide. Certainly, that's something that you can request of the board members. It's up to them whether they want to do that or not. I anticipate they will not, but that's definitely something you can ask for. Regarding when we would have a next order to release, that would happen sometime in the fall or the early winter of 2025. And it depends on the number of comments that we get. If we get a large number of comments or substantially complex comments, it may take us a little longer to consider appropriate revisions. That could delay the process. Potentially, if we've hit the sweet spot that everyone can live with, we could conceivably go as early as December, though I think the February timeline's probably a little bit more realistic.
Thank you, Robin. Looks like we got another question from Rick. Will the response activities act as certification for RGP 63 and RGP 8 where applicable?
For emergency activities, Rick, if that project qualifies for emergency certification enrollment, then you'll need to apply for enrollment under that order.
Yeah, I wanna jump in here just a little bit more there and make sure that everybody understands some of the constraints that we're working under here. We have to certify core permits, and the core really is in the driver's seat about which permit they use. So the Corps could use an emergency RGP 68 or 63, sorry, 8 or 63, or they could use their new Wildfire RGP. In those cases, we have to provide a certification. And in general, that will be an individual certification. This permit could provide coverage that would qualify as an individual certification in some cases, but more likely we would use the existing RGP certifications that we have. Rick, does that help you out?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, thank you again, Rick. And we've got one more from Kyler. Can you please elaborate on the rationale with requiring full-time monitoring for all covered activities, even upland activities that may be distant from waters?
That full-time monitoring, Kyler, is only required during active construction. So we didn't capture the full scope of that requirement in the chat here. I just want to make that clear for everyone else on the line. And it's required for activities that are distant from waters only if it's on a more vulnerable and in a more vulnerable environmental setting, as discussed. So on those steeper slopes or erosive soils, there's still potential for the discharge of waste from those construction activities. So that was our rationale. I want to add one more thing with that, Alex. Thank you. So our intent there, Kyler, just for additional background, is to ensure that work is being conducted in the field as it's being committed to on paper. And really absent monitoring and oversight during active construction is the only way to truly know that those effective BMPs are properly in place. So that was our intent with the monitoring requirement there.
Thank you.
Yeah,
That
I'll
makes
throw
sense.
a couple other things in there too, which is when we looked at the examples that we had of projects that had impacts to water quality, one of the things that we noticed was that in many cases, the activity could be happening fairly far away from waters relative to what we typically think of. You know, most of our distance requirements in the permit where we have them are approximately the same as the CGP, where they don't align identically. We're talking 50, 100 feet. However, when we looked at the projects that were on steep slopes, you know, we were seeing significant impacts to waters of the state, you know, over 1,000 feet away. And so that it didn't seem like there was a reasonable minimum distance that would be applicable in most cases without making it an unsupportable distance. So for example, we could say, up to a half a mile away, but I think there's few projects, if any, that are going to be a half a mile away from any potential water source. So that seemed inappropriate for us to try and come up with an arbitrary distance. The other issue there too is we have heard from the folks at the regional boards that in many cases, what they're seeing out in the field are very good plans that aren't being consistently implemented, especially when we're having the contract staff that are coming from out of state and aren't familiar with our programs. And so we feel it's appropriate and important to make sure that there's a little additional oversight over what's going on right now, to ensure that the crews know what they're required to do. So that's the two basic reasons for that monitoring approach.
Thank you. Appreciate the explanation.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Kyler. So that's all the questions that we have in the chat right now. I think that would mean that this is last call. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to ask? Any other burning curiosities?
Can they raise their hand if they want to?
They should be able to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So feel free to raise your hand too.
Yeah.
It looks like Rick has his hand raised.
Yeah, Rick?
Hey, sorry, it's just easier to ask than to try and type it. But
Yep.
kind of related to what you were just talking about. So that refers to any project with the 30% slope in the K value. Is that something that, under would it be a category A, and then therefore we would have to kind of catalog and track all those projects everywhere? I'm just trying to get my head around the intent behind that language.
Yes.
Go ahead, Jean.
So the distinction there, Rick, and thanks for bringing attention to that language, is that you would have to track activities conducted under category A. And we don't provide level of detail as to tracking every monitoring event that occurs. And so I'm already seeing that as a potential for one piece of clarity that we could provide within the order, but the intent is that you track all covered activities and you conduct monitoring. You will not be required to report on that monitoring. You're only required to, as written, you're required to prepare a list of projects that are conducted under category A. So the monitor, I'm sure there's a better way to say that.
Yeah, let me jump in here a little bit. We did release an administrative draft last year, and we got some feedback both from the utility companies as well as from our regional boards that there was concern about the amount of administrative work that would be required to implement it. And in talking to the regional boards, we realized that there's a lot that the utility companies are doing that really is not something that we need to be in a position to weigh in or approve in advance. There's a lot of work that gone out there where we know the utility companies have good plans in place, they need to be implemented, but frankly, we don't feel a need to provide a level of oversight in real time for those locations. Rather, what we've said is, hey, for these lower risk projects, we have a certain set of minimum requirements. We expect you to implement those minimum requirements, but we'd really rather not have you guys deal with the administrative burden or have to deal with it on our end to do the NOI. So we've done a non-notifying process for those. For those projects that are either on steep slopes and highly erodible soils or that cross water bodies, in many cases, there's either a higher risk or it triggers another regulatory issue that we've got to deal with, such as 401. And so for those that we realize that, hey, we really do have to continue with an NOI process. But the intention here is to ensure that we are providing an administratively streamlined process. Now, at the end of the day, Rick, for reasonable compliance oversight work, we do think it's important for us to know when and where you've actually used the permit. And so we are asking that be provided. Is it an annual or a quarterly basis? I think it's an annual, right?
So it's actually listed on page 14 of the order for those who want to look at the details, and it's that you maintain a list of project activity coordinates and activity dates. And that list just be provided to water board staff within 10 days of
Okay.
request. So there's no duration.
Yeah, so
But-
there's a, we went back and forth about what was reasonable, and it looks like we ended up with, please just keep records of that, and if we have an issue, we will come talk to you about it, and at that point, we may need to inspect a site, but frankly, we don't anticipate that happening very often. It's short of a complaint. Rick, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Rick. And we got one more from Kyler. Will the conditions of the permit influence the scope of utility work? For example, for an access road project, if the scope of road work is limited to improving the road surface and there are waterway crossings within the project area, are utilities obligated to redesign and maintain the waterway crossing per the order's standards and conditions? Or do the waterway crossing design and maintenance standards only apply if the scope of work includes maintaining or improving the waterway crossing?
I would want to ask some clarifying questions, and so maybe this is something we can take offline, but let me give you just a basic high-level response, which is we had a lot of internal deliberations about whether or not we should be requiring the upgrade of existing roads. And we opted not to do that for a few different reasons, one of which is that we did get comments from both the utility companies and some of our sister agencies that the utility companies may not have the authorities to upgrade existing roadways. We also had there was also some concern about what we're trying to achieve with this permit in terms of ensuring that we're supporting the wildfire mitigation work that the utility companies are doing. So at the end of the day, we opted not to include upgrades to existing roadways. And that's why Gene said, if you're just passing over a roadway, there's no requirement to upgrade it. Once you have determined that an upgrade is needed or a crossing is needed to be established where no crossing was required before, we do have some minimum requirements, and we do expect that those minimum requirements would be followed. So that includes things like ensuring culverts are appropriately sized and making sure that we have appropriate protective measures for water crossings that don't already have a culvert. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. And I think that's sort of the common sense way to interpret the permit. I just wanted to ask that clarifying question.
Yeah.
So appreciate the response.
All right, thank you, Kyler. And we got one more from Timothy Andrews at PG&E. Is the state amenable to considering a programmatic fee structure to reduce the shared administrative burden of the permit?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer to that is yes. Gene mentioned that we are not proposing anything other than a clarification of what part of the fee regulation is applicable. As part of this project, we do have a separate fee development process that is underway right now. We aren't at this point proposing any changes to it that would relate to the utility projects. Having said that, I do want to say that if your project includes any kind of dredge or fill, that would go under the dredge or fill portion of the fee schedule. And that is a programmatic fee structure. And it's based on the numbers of distribution miles, transmission miles. I'd have to look at the fee rates. It's essentially scaled to the size of the utility. There are other ways that we could structure it, and this is something that we'd be happy to talk to you about. We're not going to take it on as part of this project, but we do have that parallel fee setting exercise that we do.
Thank you.
Okay, we've now reached the end of all of our comments in the comment section. So I think we can go ahead and wrap this up.
Let's put out another call. Does anybody have any additional questions? Feel free to raise your hand. You don't have to explain it in the chat. I know that takes time to get it right.
And I'd also like to say that, we're happy to speak with you. We've already had some requests to meet outside of the stakeholder, the public workshop and board hearing. We are happy to see if we can accommodate that. There's certainly a limit on what we can do, but we will try and accommodate as much of that as we can.
Yeah, especially for those who are viewing the webcast version of today's meeting, if something was mentioned that you'd like to go into greater detail on, please